2 years ago on Easter Sunday, it was April the 1st. Yes, April Fool's Day. And I thought that ministers and atheists alike would have a heyday with that. I began my Easter homily that year by reading an obscure passage from the Gospel of Peter. Now, the Gospel of Peter didn't make the cut as one of those books in the canon of the Christian scriptures as we know them. The Gospel of Peter had all kinds of weird and miraculous events occurring regarding and surrounding the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Flying and talking crosses, men descending from heaven, and Jesus actually preaching to the dead. And so I read that passage, and then I said April Fools, because people were scratching their head and saying, I don't remember ever hearing that in the resurrection story, the Easter story. This year, 2 weeks ago on April Fool, I woke up thinking, maybe it's all a hoax, an elaborate April Fool's joke, this pandemic. But unfortunately, it's not. I did, however, get a kick out of how many parents, especially in the UK, convinced their kids to get ready and walk back to school. And if you'd like to get a good laugh, you can watch some of those on video on YouTube yourself. But it's not April Fool's. It's not an April Fool's prank. No matter how much we would wish and like that this pandemic would go away and say April Fools and be done with it, we can't. I think we feel very much like those early disciples of Jesus must have felt on that first Good Friday morning. Back in late January, or maybe it was even late February, it seems like a lifetime ago, I was in Phoenix, Arizona, as I was driving out to California on Route 66. I went into a beautiful southwestern Tex-Mex style church and enjoyed looking at the structure and the beauty of that place. And then I walked out into the courtyard and saw an amazing sculpture. A sculpture of the friends of Jesus taking his lifeless body down from the cross. And probably as never before, it brought home the seemingly finality of that event. For perspective to me. How his earliest disciples must have felt abandoned, rejected, unfulfilled, demonized, demoralized, hopeless, betrayed. And that sculpture, and you can see pictures of it attached with the email I'm sending out today. One solitary figure is sitting off to the side, social distancing, and looking very much alone, abandoned, and isolated. And so I ask you, who among us hasn't felt like that in the past 2 or 3 weeks? I know I have. And therefore I'm pretty certain you have as well. Listen to the words and the expressions of those same emotions recorded just 3 days later in our gospel for Easter Sunday. John chapter 20. It sets the stage. It's almost like one of those in the last episode vignettes we see on the Netflix TV series that many of us have been watching of late. John chapter 20. And in verse 1 and 2 it says this: Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw the stone was moved away from the entrance. And she ran at once to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one that Jesus loved, breathlessly panting. They took the master from the tomb. And we don't know where they put him. And then in verse 10 we read, and the disciples then went back home. Home. They went home. Many of us are stuck at home, remaining at home, working at home. Verse 11 it says, Mary stood outside the tomb, weeping. Just this past week on the radio, I heard a gentleman say that some days he goes to the lake and goes fishing and says, "Isn't this wonderful?" And on others, he can't stop crying.